Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime with my last Saga of Darren Shan reread video. This one is going to be for Book 12, Sons of Destiny. So yeah, Book 12, right at the end of the series, the third book of the Vampire Destiny trilogy that ends everything off. And yeah, this was a really cool book to go back to because this is obviously the one I have sort of the most memories of sort of reading it for the first time, because for the most part I would say it was one of the first series of books where I was like right at the end waiting for the last book to come out, and then I always remember I liked the ending of this series, and I typically tend to struggle with the ending of certain series. As you've probably seen from other stuff I've reviewed on my channel, whether that be anime, manga, TV series, whatever, endings are tough. And in my mind, the Saga of Darren Shan ends really, really well. This is a very good final book. So I suppose let's just kind of get straight into this. It's interesting, the structure on this one, in that it is broken down into a part 1 and a part 2, with part 1 being the sort of present day story coming to an end, and then part 2 being our sort of epilogue that involves a little bit of time travel, Lake of Souls style stuff, but bringing the series to an end in a very interesting but in many ways like ideal way in my mind. It's not a sort of purely happy ending, but it is a sort of hopeful ending, but we'll get there. So it means that only about half of this book is actually focused on the end of the War of Scars, but that's where the last book ended us off. We had to continue on the event that we were in at the end of the last book into here. So we obviously ended up with the death of Shankus, and then the reveal that Darius is actually Annie's son, so it's Darren's nephew. That was a really big twist, so the immediate revenge that Darren was about to take, he suddenly can't take it. And so we start off this book like, okay, how does he react to this? And in a way, like, it's interesting that what happens here of just there's no hesitation. It's just no. They stop caring about Darius. Like, he just immediately lets him go. He can't go through with it. It's not even a question of if he will. It's just he's not holding on to him anymore, because it's still the continued reaction to the brutal and tragic death of Shankus and what Steve just did, and the fact that him doing that has an effect on everyone, like I said last time, including RV. It kind of completely changes his perspective, given that he has been a character since his reintroduction who has seemed like one of the most bloodthirsty. This is the thing where he's like, no, I do not agree with this. This is not the way we do things. So he's kind of turned a couple of people against him. But of course, Gannon is still going ahead with this. And, we get some interesting back and forth here of just kind of like, why do you continue to go ahead with this? And Gannon's interesting in that he ultimately goes ahead with it because, look, Steve is the Lord of the Vampires, so he follows him because of that. But you also get the sort of perspective from him where he's kind of like, I'll do everything I can to try and protect Steve, but if Steve does go down, he'll be happy enough that it's kind of ended that way. Like, he's going to try and help the Vampires win, but he's, for the most part, just sort of done with all of this. He's glad the final encounter is coming up, and he's ready to see how it plays out. So even he is not the most happy with Steve as the Lord of the Vampires. But it's a pretty kind of brutal sequence. We obviously get them sort of leaving at this point, and we set up the actual final encounter a little bit later on. So it allows us to have a bit of a kind of break moment just before the final battle, where we deal with the death of Shankus and we address what we're going to do with Darius. And mainly that involves, okay, he's been blooded as a vampire. We have to address that. But to do that, we have to talk to Annie. So even though Darren has wanted to stay out of her life, things have changed now that, Darius is in play and he is related to Annie. So they go to see her. I think this is a really kind of fun moment. It's emotional, of course, Annie faints the second she realizes that it's real. This is actually Darren, her brother she thought has been dead for so long. And when she wakes back up, she listens to the story, but she can't fully believe all of this. She's very much like, no, this can't happen because I don't want it to happen, but it is the truth. And, you know, they don't do the like, oh, let me show you the vampire powers. It's just, this is the case. I like that Darius at this point speaks up. He has been one of the ones affected most heavily by the death of Shankus, that basically he has just seen his father kill someone, a child the same age as him, more or less, and has immediately seen that everything that Darren has said about him is true, and that pretty much everything he said has been a lie. So it's a really nice one where the thing that really puts sort of Annie over the edge to realizing it's him is, you never told anyone about Madame Octa, did you? And that's very fitting, given that it was sort of, you know, the whole secret of what happened in like the first book, and it's so telling that that's been that sort of deep secret she's held onto for so long. That's the thing that ultimately, you know, convinces her that it's him. She also tells her own story of like how, you know, Steve kind of came into her life when she was kind of a teenager, and she thought it was great, and he's being very supportive. But then the second she was pregnant, he sort of left, saying he was going to just, you know, build up money to sort of support their family to be. They're going to get married. But then he basically comes back just to be like, yep, I got what I wanted. I don't care about you. That's it. Proving to everyone that, as you would suspect in a way from the first book, and just how planning he is, how, you know, much of a sort of sociopath in a way he is based on what he did in like the previous books. Yeah, he got Annie pregnant just to sort of get one over on Darren. This is all ultimately coming back on a way to, you know, hurt Darren again, and it's just a further detail, if you needed it, to confirm that, yes, Steve has completely gone crazy. He's not seeing any sense about the details of what actually happened. And especially it being brought up again here by Darius, of just like, oh, so what is his issue with you? And Darren explains that, okay, I sacrificed myself basically to save his life after this accident happened, but he doesn't see it that way. He sees it as, I stole this thing from him, and that's blinded him for all these years. So it all builds up to, of course, we have to deal with the fact that Darius is half Vampanese, and this is an interesting one because they're like, okay, so we can just teach him, he doesn't have to kill when he eats, it'll be fine. But then Vantya comes in, he has experience, because he was previously, you know, I suppose, Vampanese and had to transfer over with the blooding. So he knows, and it's just like, no. Vampires can train to not hurt people when they feed. The Vampanese can't really. So the only option here is to reblood Darius. We're going to have to make him a vampire, and that's going to be the only way where he can sort of live a relatively normal life. There's no going back. He's going to be a vampire or a Vampanese. The choice just has to be made here. So ultimately, even though the risk is death for Darren and Darius, they have to go ahead with it. And it's interesting that they basically are like, okay, Darren is the one who has to do it because he's still kind of undergoing the purge, but they're like, that kind of will work in our favor because your vampire cells are hyperactive. That should actually help things ultimately. It'll put you in a pretty bad situation because you're already sort of weak from that and everything that's happened. He's been wounded from the last book, but this is the way to do it. And ultimately, yeah, Darren goes through sort of convulsions as it happens, but Darius is going to be okay. But this sort of puts him out of action for the rest of the book, and they just focus on the safety of everyone after this point. We also get, like, I think it's Harkat, Debbie, and Evra go back to the Cirque du Freak with Shankus's body. But then we basically set up the idea that the final encounter is going to happen at the stadium. And so it's this big sequence, like everyone is here. We have the Vampirites, the Vampets, We find out that Steve basically has sort of control of the police force here. It's another one of his sort of engineered scenarios where he's in complete control. He lets the hunters in to see him, and he's putting on another show for everyone. In this case, like, he's captured, obviously, everyone left at the Cirque du Freak. He's killed a bunch of the other performers. He's like standing on top of one of their corpses. He has Shankus like hung up by the broken neck on like a hangman's kind of post, just to show everyone. It's really, really brutal. Like, he's completely gone off the deep end at this point, and it's just this brutal situation. And when everyone comes in, of course, you think that Ever's wife is going to be really angry at Darren, and she acts that way so it doesn't look like she's communicating, but she's understanding of, it's not your fault. We now see that it's Steve who is the truly evil one. He has done all of this. We don't blame you. We will fight when you fight back here. And that's what it's all about, basically. It's more grandstanding from Steve, and the action set piece kind of happens after this point. It breaks out. Everyone breaks out. It's Cirque du Freak members versus Vampanese. Everyone's in play here, but of course, the main focus is the sort of four key characters here, who is obviously Darren, Vansha, Gannon, and Steve. That's the four that you're focused on. But of course, Debbie is escaping. We have Alice in the background, Harkat. They're all kind of important as well. But those are the key characters. They do give RV his sort of send-off here in the scene with Cormac Limbs. And it's actually kind of fitting in a way of like the character who has the ability that if RV had, he would have never had any of his problems. He would have just grown his hands back. But he's the guy he comes up against. And obviously Cormac Limbs, he doesn't put up much of a fight against RV. His limbs grow back. But then he basically taunts RV into cutting his head off. Something Cormac Limbs has never done before. He's never risked it not working. But we find out here that it actually does work. He survives this. But the way his head works is that if he gets his head cut off, two heads grow and they're just smaller. So he gets confirmation that I suppose he's sort of invincible to a degree here. I don't really know if that's what they're trying to say here. Of like, I guess the fact that his head was cut off is actually what saved him here. Whereas maybe if RV had just damaged his brain enough, he would have killed him. But because he cut his head off, it immediately activated his sort of regrowing ability. Either way, this causes RV to kind of go crazy, but then he turns up a little bit later on in the fight, the final showdown. So it's a pretty cool sequence, but we basically build to the big showdown of like the final four characters fighting. It's Vansha versus Gannon. It's Steve versus Darren. Darren, once again, in an awful situation here after just having blooded someone. He's going through the purge, and he's wounded from before, whereas Steve is relatively fresh. The others are relatively fresh, but again, Vansha is also at a disadvantage against his brother because he was just involved in a lot of battles and so on. So Vansha ends up getting injured by Gannon, and it looks like it's going to be fatal, but Evanna is actually the one to say that no, it's going to be okay. Gannon ends up getting sort of knocked out by RV as he comes through, and it's a sort of redemption of just he doesn't agree with his side in this case, knocks out Gannon. So it leads it down to the final two here, Steve versus Darren. And interestingly, their final fight ends up just sort of taking place under an old bridge. And it's just in sort of close quarters. They can't use any big weaponry. It's just a brutal knife fight to the death. And it's just they're nicking each other all over the place, cutting each other's sides open, bits off their elbows, cuts on the stomach, and it's just building up to like, okay, what's going to happen here? Darren actually gets the advantage and is about to win when suddenly like the purge hits him really hard. He's kind of temporarily blinded. Steve sort of stabs him, but it's not like it's a big blow, but it's not like the final blow of the fight. And at this point, we get to a situation where Mr. Tiny and Evanna are there, like directly, like right next to them, watching the fight. This is, destiny about to play out. This is what he's been building up to the entire time. Because you have to remember that from like the last book and onwards, they've been setting up that this fight is who will become the Lord of Shadows. And it's either going to be Darren or it's going to be Steve. And the big character setup we have is that Darren can get out of being Lord of Shadows, but he has to do that by dying and Steve getting that position, which is just as worse. But the other situation is that he kills Steve, and even though he doesn't want to, that act is going to send him down the path of becoming the Lord of Shadows. So how does he get around this situation? And this is where it all plays out, and it's so interesting of eventually, Darren delivers this final blow. Steve, of course, grandstanding allows Darren to, he thinks he's won, allowed Darren to sort of set up a final sequence and stab Steve straight through the heart. So Darren has won the fight, basically. Steve isn't dead yet, but this is fatal. This is a fatal blow. He's not going to recover from this. And so then we set up like the last few chapters before the change of part is Mr. Tiny being like, well done. Like, he's so happy that this has turned out this way. And he sort of reveals that, like, Evanna, I said it, didn't I? I always thought Darren would be the one to win. Fantastic. You're going to be the new Lord of Shadows. You're going to join me. This is what we're going to do together. It's all going to work out in my favor. Fantastic. And this is where the big reveal, the name of the book really comes from. It's not just this symbolic thing of like destiny has led them both to this moment, but like literally Des Tiny has led them both to this moment, as he reveals that he is Darren's father, and also later on it gets revealed that he's Steve's father as well. And this isn't just some sort of symbolic thing again because he's like Mr. Destiny, but no, like literally Darren's dad, who we met before, isn't actually his dad. It is Mr. Tiny because of Mr. Tiny things. And it's all about this plan that he had of like his own children, Mr. Tall and Evanna, because they were born with his powers to see into the future, were basically incapable of really changing their own destiny in a way. Because they have those powers, they could potentially ruin the world because they have these powers, that it kind of locks them. So he wanted mortal children who he would have an influence over, he would care about, but who could make things exciting for him. So that's where the idea for Steve and Darren came from. And it's this kind of shocking reveal right at the end that we felt that he's been behind this the whole time. And now, more than any other time, he's directly said it. It's been one thing that, like, okay, he reincarnated Kurda as Harkat to help Darren survive a lot of situations. But now we sort of find out that, oh yeah, every sort of situation that led the both of them down this path, Mr. Tiny has guided their hands. He reveals that, like, he was the one back in the first book who told Darren when to close his hand, to grab the ticket to Cirque du Freak. He's the one who basically more or less influenced Mr. Crepsley to blood Darren. That's been a sort of big mystery throughout this, of like, Mr. Crepsley almost doesn't know himself why he did it. And it's because it was just this nudge of destiny by Mr. Tiny. That's why he did it. And it's this really, really, shocking scene of just that this has all just been a setup. Their lives, like they've been able to make decisions. Things have been able to go different ways, but fundamentally, they've always been led down this path by Mr. Tiny. They just didn't realize like how heavy it was, that their whole lives have been a lie to a degree. And it ends with this kind of final sequence of just like, we're going to be monsters together. We're going to have so much fun. Steve is kind of like, Father, help me. I'm dying. And he's like, no. And he basically disowns Steve at this moment. So for Steve, even though like he's been this evil character so far, he gets sort of what Mr. Crepsley did to him done again to him by Mr. Tiny. He just gets abandoned. You don't get to even be this thing. I disown you now. Darren is my only son. And so Steve is just broken at this point for everything that's happened. So broken that even though Darren at this point has figured out sort of what to do, he leaves Steve's hand with a knife open to do anything. Steve is unwilling to act, even though he can kill Darren here. So it forces Darren to sort of do the only thing that will get Steve angry at him again, which is to say that, okay, yes, I did plot with Mr. Crepsley to, get you out of the picture, so I become the vampire, and now everyone's laughing at you, I'm laughing at you, like you're such a fool. This does get Steve, who's dying, angry enough to stab Darren, and he just keeps stabbing him. And the big twist is, okay, what if they both die? Then there's no Lord of Shadows. That Mr. Tiny has been so focused on just this idea that it has to go one way or the other, that he never considered the scenario of what if neither happened? What if neither of the two of them survived their encounter? Now that's obviously, you get the impression, that's why he was there. Because he's even saying as Darren wins, like, okay, your allies are over here, you go to them, they'll bring you to hospital, that's how you'll survive even though you're injured. He's making sure Darren survives and heals in the aftermath of this. But he never accounted for this, and this, as we go forward in the book, ends up being a really important point of development for Evanna, who has doubled down at the first section of this book of like, I can't interfere. I will roughly guide you and tell you when this is a key moment in terms of like, if you don't decide to do this now, this will happen. But she's not making any decision either way, and has been a kind of frustrating character because of that. And she's now sort of seen, because you saw her react when Mr. Tiny said that Darren and Steve were his sons. She's like, what? Like, in her mind, that's him breaking one of the rules of being sort of a godlike figure. The rule that she can't break, Mr. Tall can't break, but he's seemingly done that here. So she's also suffered this sort of sense of betrayal, and has felt that, the situation Mr. Tiny set up, there are only the two ways. Steve or Darren becomes Lord of Shadows. But that didn't happen. And I really like the character development that Evanna has sort of undergone after both of them die, as we sort of get to next, of just defeat the person who meddles with destiny by taking away the thing he wants, ruining his fun in the end, and just, ending the moment before the interlude with just, I died. Our main character dies at this point, and we've got roughly half a book to go. We get a sequence of him like in the Lake of Souls, just reflecting on everything that happened. I think it's really well done of just highlighting that it's timelessness. He just kind of comes and goes as however many years pass, and like he thinks this thing then this thing, but then suddenly he's pulled out. Suddenly he's alive again, and it's the little people who have taken him out, and eventually Evanna comes over to him. And this is a super interesting, massive conversation that they have, because all of a sudden he meets Evanna again and realizes, like, oh, you're my half-sister. Like, we're actually related here. And so there's a little bit more of a connection here between the two of them, because they are actually related, our father, and it actually, like, makes sense. So we get this situation, like one of the first reveals here is that Darren can actually control the dragons, and that even though he purposefully created the situation where Steve and Darren are his actual children, but specifically born without his powers, some of his powers still leaked through. So Darren's ability to control animals to such a degree is actually an ability that ultimately comes from Mr. Tiny. So that's kind of a cool reveal here. It's something even Evanna can't do. We also get the reveal here that the dragons, where they come from, is that Darren's old friend, Alan, from like the first book, he was the one who actually created the first dragons from like dinosaur DNA. And so it's just this situation of like, again, Mr. Tiny has engineered this situation. He is always doing this, and she just explains the full scope of Mr. Tiny, that like like throughout his history, basically, the Egyptians, all the rise and falls of the empires over the years, has been his doing. He wanted to make something happen with the vampires. That, yes, the story of like how Evanna and Mr. Tall came into being is important, but that kind of just led him onto this path of how he could manipulate things with the vampires and the vampanese. And like, there's a lot of reveals that come out here, including that the Stone of Blood is actually a dragon brain that Mr. Tiny brought from the future into the past, and that the whole reveal of like the Stone of Blood will be the thing that allows the vampire clan to sort of rise up and kind of be triumphant again, is because it would allow them to control the dragons using a vampire brain. So a lot of that stuff is just like really, really interesting. There's just so much information here. And yeah, it's just this idea of like him just gradually nudging things has always been how he approaches doing things. We get the reveal that like the way things work here is that like there's no time paradoxes here. So you know, the example they use is, you know, going back into the past to kill Hitler. How would that work? Can't you just stop what he did by killing Hitler? But she just notes that no, the universe will always fix things. That, you know, he is such an ultimately important person in terms of how he affects the world, that if Hitler were to die, there would just be another person who rises up and basically does the same things that Hitler does. So you can't inherently change the past by just taking out one thing. So Mr. Tiny alters the sort of future, how it's going to play out, by subtly nudging a lot of smaller things in that direction, which is sort of how he ended up doing things with the vampires and the vampanese. And they just kind of cover how he came to, you know, manipulate the kind of clans over the years. And one way he did it this way, but then he altered their powers so that they'd be in this position where eventually people would leave and the vampanese would form. Just how in control he actually is about all of this. So we then actually go to meet with Mr. Tiny, which is like kind of crazy. Darren does not want to talk to him after everything that's happened. And, you know, they start to reveal a little bit more about the whole idea of like, basically what is Mr. Tiny, what is Evanna, Mr. Tall. And they get to the idea that they are creatures of universal chaos. Now, Evanna kind of explains that Mr. Tiny is actually sort of like a weaker version of those creatures of universal chaos, but effectively Mr. Tiny is still one of these, because that's what he does. But they get across that if he breaks any of the rules of, you know, having these powers, you'll unleash these monsters that will just completely destroy the world in a way even worse than the Lord of Shadows would. So lots of like super interesting stuff going on. This is when probably the key development for Evanna here is that she reveals that, look, Darren, like, you showed me the way here. You showed me that it probably was a mistake for me to not even ever attempt to influence things. She notes that, like, Mr. Tall sort of was maybe on the right path in terms of at least trying to stand up for, you know, his people, the Cirque du Freak, by standing up for things, and that in the same way that Mr. Tiny takes risks to influence to get futures that he likes, she has to do the same, but to try and achieve peace. And Darren, in basically foiling Mr. Tiny's plan, has more or less given her the idea about how to do that. That these situations where Mr. Tiny sets it up where it has to go this way or that way, what if you create another path? And so the big twist that we get to is that, okay, we've known for quite a few books, Evanna is the only one capable of having a child with a vampire or a vampanese. And she made a deal with Mr. Tiny to she'd be able to like basically fish Darren out, give him a chance to sort of fix things, a chance to be a little person for a while. In exchange, she will have a child with a vampire or vampanese. But she sort of tricks him by saying, I can choose, right? Yes. And so the big reveal comes out is that she actually is pregnant with 2 children. One vampanese, one vampire. And it's by Vanja and Ganon. So the idea that she came up with, it's sort of similar to the way Darren did things, of just by like either, you know, using both options or taking away both options, and that's how you sort of get around Mr. Tiny's method of kind of creating these scenarios. And this one is kind of cool because she just kind of points out that it means that, you know, there's going to be these sort of like hybrid children that are like sort of like part her, part vampire, part Vampanese, and her children will be able to have children of their own, and they'll all be able to sort of like mix together. And so the idea is that going forward, they'll be like part vampires, part Vampanese, and that by default will just bring peace over time. She does, I think, establish roughly that Vansha and Harkat are attempting to bring peace, that the War of Scars is still going on in the like years that Darren's been in the Lake of Souls, but it is slowly coming to an end now that the sort of the Lord of the Vampanese is sort of gone. So lots and lots of very, very interesting things going on here. But yeah, the ultimate kind of twist in all of this is that we go to Mr. Tiny, we find out where he lives, basically his house, and we get some interesting things about him. Is that he basically collects things that humans create. So he collects art, he loves music that humans create. But Evanna points out that he does not have any interest in like books or literature. He just does not particularly like that at all, because I suppose for him, who is so focused on manipulating like real events to be as interesting as possible, the idea of like stories made up in a way don't really appeal to him, even though perhaps they should. So he just has zero interest in books, which is an interesting setup for the final stage of, I suppose, Evanna's plan to trick her father, which is that, you know, a book that Darren in the future is going to write, Mr. Tiny will never come across it, and so he'll never be able to influence the effect that this book will have. But we'll get there. It's an interesting reveal. So Darren is going to be made into a little person, and right at the end we get this reveal that, okay, this is something Evanna wants for Darren. It's going to give him a chance, because of course he ended up in the Lake of Souls, meaning that he hasn't gone to sort of, you know, paradise, as they've said. So this is Evanna's way to basically let Darren go on to paradise. He'll live as a little person for a bit, and then when he dies, he won't go back to the Lake of Souls. He'll go on, and that was her sort of, you know, attempt to, you know, fix his life in a way. That Steve is gonna be in the Lake of Souls, I suppose, forever. She acknowledges that, you know, he had the option to not go down the path that he did. You, who were trying your best not to go down that path, but seemingly were locked into it, still found a way to break out of it. And you did that by sacrificing yourself. You deserve a chance to fix things. So the big thing that happens here, he's made into a little person and then is basically sent back into the past. And the big twist here is that the little person, who at one stage during the Cirque du Freak sequence in the first book was selling them souvenirs, was actually Darren as a little person. So he gets to be in the same scene as young Darren, young Steve, at the Cirque du Freak sequence that, you know, starts this whole sequence of events off. The twist, though, is that in his robes as a little person, he's been given a few items. I think he has like weapons, but also notably his diary. And that's the thing. That is the thing that Mr. Tiny is going to be blind to, that is going to continue with Darren through the time travel into this sequence. So he ends up meeting with Mr. Tall, and there's a really interesting sort of connection here where Mr. Tall realizes that, oh, this is Evanna's doing. And he makes this sort of connection that, like, oh, it's that boy from the future. And basically Darren hands over his journals, which have been finished at this point, to tell the full story to Mr. Tall. And the agreement is that he's going to wait a bit until, you know, Darren's much older, and then he will send the books to Darren. And the hope from, you know, our present day Darren is that the, you know, Darren, who's going to live a normal life, he will at some point write these books, publish them, make money, but that the ultimate impact that they have is that they will become known to the vampires and the vampanese, and that just how this book plays out and how realistic it is based on the War of Scars, they will realize what they need to avert, and that because he accepts that what's going to happen is that the way things work is that he's going to eliminate himself from being one of Mr. Tiny's pawns, but that someone else will take that place. But he can fix what's happening to them by making it a bit easier, that Mr. Tiny, not knowing about the book as a potential way things will plan out, that will actually fix things, and that because I suppose this other person won't be responsible for what they're doing, they'll go on to paradise by themselves as well. So, it feels like everything is sort of accounted for here. He scares his prior self away before Darren spies on Steve's meeting with Mr. Crepsley, which is the one way to sort of stop this, because that way Darren doesn't act suspicious, Steve doesn't get suspicious of Darren and create the whole dynamic. Darren never gets Madame Octa. Steve, still has to accept what happens with the being called evil by Mr. Crepsley, but because he'll never develop the thing that ultimately sends him down the path of hatred, thinking that Darren was the one who actually betrayed him, they'll just go on normally and I suppose be friends going forward. And someday Darren will go on to be sent a series of diaries. He'll change some names, some details, but he'll publish those books, and then hopefully those books will be acknowledged by the vampires and vampanese and realize that the books are almost like a prophecy of how things will turn out. Make steps to avoid that. And so the book ends with little person Darren, I suppose just dying on top of the Cirque du Freak, basically sort of where it all started, and actually kind of moving on. And just, the final sequence here, I'm gone. The end, it is really, really fitting of just, the character who sort of sacrificed himself to save his friend in the first book, sacrifices himself to save a lot of people, save the world. It's very, very fitting in my mind. Reading it again, I still liked how this works as an ending just as much as I did all those years ago. So that's definitely a huge positive. Obviously, the big benefit that this has is that the reveal, the monologue from Mr. Tiny during the final fight reveals so much information, it's fantastic. And then the sort of monologue from Evanna in the second part, that all works so well. The way they discuss, I suppose, the details about Mr. Tiny and what he does and stuff like that, it makes you so happy that they avoided his kind of plan coming through. It's amazing how sort of interconnected everything is. But really liked going back through this full series. I was happy that I was able to do this like weekly for the last 12 weeks. There was no need for a break or anything like that. And look, there's other Darren Shan books that I would like to do videos on. I definitely won't be doing them immediately. I'm definitely going to be taking a break from doing just Darren Shan book reviews on the channel for at least a while. But I'm going to leave the door open to maybe eventually getting around to doing stuff like the Saga of Larkin Crepsley prequel books. There's 4 of them. I might review them. The series that followed this is the Demonata series. It's not interlinked as far as I'm aware. It's just a separate series of books, starting off with Lord Loss. I really love those books as well. I might cover them and stuff like that. But again, it probably won't be for quite a while. I'll see how things go, I suppose, next year, about maybe getting around to doing more of the Darren Shan books. I suppose the final thing I'll say is just that in case you're unaware, perhaps as a big Darren Shan fan, there is a manga adaptation of the Saga of Darren Shan. For the most part, it's been out of print for quite a while, but Yen Press, who publish a lot of light novels in English, are actually going to be reprinting the entire manga series of the Saga of Darren Shan starting in January. I believe it was 12 volumes as well. They are going to be doing omnibus editions where it's 2 volumes in one, and the first one's coming out in January, so that's pretty exciting. I myself have only like skimmed through some of them that I've seen in bookstores. I don't actually own any of them, so it's going to be fun collecting this new omnibus format for the manga. Obviously really like manga, and getting a visual adaptation of this is really, really good. I suppose final thoughts is just, if I had any maybe complaint about this, is just perhaps Harkat isn't really maybe much of a focus in this one. I appreciate that they do bring up that, like, they say, like, specifically Vansha and Harkat are the ones really campaigning for peace on the vampire side of things, that he seems to have found a position in Vampire Mountain as, you know, Harkat / Kurda, but he maybe could have character-wise been a little bit more in focus. But other than that, I really, really loved going back to this series overall, and specifically this last book. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.